Essentially, I did this kind of film school route, and when I was a kid, from a very early age, I kind of realized that I wanted to get into movies, you know, like kids do. I wanted to be a fireman briefly, and then I was like, no, movies are way cooler. I want to be involved in that. And so originally I set out to sort of direct, and just quite by chance, in the second film school I went to, I applied late, so it was kind of oversubscribed, the directing course. This was in Sheffield in the north of England. And they were like, look, we'd love to take you, but why don't you just, you could come back next year, or you could just hang around. Somebody will drop out. These directors, they come and go. So I was like, all right, I'll stick around and sit and hope, And so I just ticked the next box down, which was cinematography, and I knew nothing about it. And I still don't know anything about it. But I kind of fell in love, and that was kind of it, really. And after that, I stayed in that city, the city of Sheffield, because they had a really great music scene there. And within that music scene, everybody's kind of friends, and there's a good art scene. And we just started making like video installation work, music videos, that kind of stuff. And kind of sort of snowballed from there. And then I moved back to London and started in commercials and started getting movies. And there was a film called Boy A, which I shot very, very early on, a few years back now, about 10, 15 years ago. And that, I think, was the sort of start of things. That was kind of the first time I'd shot something where I really felt like, actually, this could be the beginning of a sort of a thought process, which meant that in terms of the way I kind of like to, or try to photograph things, that not only does it serve the story, but there's also a sort of a methodology, as it were, to my madness. And I think with that movie, that's where it sort of began, where I started to kind of like, things like composition, lighting started to fall into place a little bit. And since then, it's just really been an exploration with every film, As you'd all know, with every film is different, and you learn something new.
Right, so you did some commercials,
yeah,
and then crossing over into feature films, right?
Crossed into features, yeah.
So commercials bring to the table what? Discipline, very tight turnarounds?
Yeah, exactly. I think it was sort of a combination of things, really, but a lot of people politics, actually, which I think is something that is so important in this business, because as you all know, it's like as an art form, you have many things combining to make a movie. I mean, it's a miracle, actually, that movies are ever made at all, simply because you've got, great minds all coming together trying to make this one thing and make it seamless. I just completely lost my thread. What did you say?
Yeah, commercials versus feature films, very tight turnarounds.
Yeah, so then the commercials kind of taught me that in a very short, sharp way, in a very quick way. And, I sort of got to travel a lot and got to work with a lot of different people of varying degrees of talent. And that was a great learner for me. It was a great sort of area, as you say, discipline as well, which has served me well in the long form.
Right. So how did Ex Machina come about as a project? How did you get involved? What was the spark that triggered it all?
Yeah, I mean, I was aware of Alex a long time ago. He wrote a book called The Beach, which sort of became this kind of backpacker's Bible back in the early 90s, I think it was. And he was like 24 when he wrote it. And it just kind of, he went stratospheric because of that. And then he sort of disappeared a little bit off the radar. And I think it was because he simply wasn't that interested in writing novels anymore. And then he went down to the set of The Beach that Danny Boyle was making with DiCaprio. And he said to me, he realized when he stood on that set, and obviously it was beautiful and sunny and it was in Thailand, he was like, I realized then that I don't ever want to go back to writing novels. Actually, what I want to do is make films. So he'd already had this advance from his publishing company, which he gave back to them and said, I'm not writing any more books. I'm going to go and start writing scripts. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was very aware of his writing. I was always fascinated by the way he seemed to kind of find a good balance between what one could say is a great accessibility, but also with a real cerebral element to it. And this is no exception. It's got all of those things. So I read a script of his. The first time a script of his came to me was a film called Never Let Me Go, which Mark Romanek directed, and I interviewed for it, and I didn't actually meet Mark, but I remember the script was an adaptation of a book, but it was just so beautifully written. So I was very much then thinking, I really want to know what his next project is. I'm going to just keep an eye on it, follow it up, and then Ex Machina landed on my desk, and for no other reason, I think, than he'd seen some of my work prior to that. He'd seen Boy A and another thing called Red Riding, 74. And his brother's a DP, and he sort of recommended me to him for some reason, so I got to thank him for that. And I read the script, it blew me away. It was one of those scripts where it just is a sort of, it is like reading a novel, really. It wasn't particularly visual, but it was so immensely visual, if that makes any sense. It kind of has a real, it offered up a lot of ideas and options, and it never stopped inspiring me. And we spoke, and I was like, dude, I'm your man. It was just that simple. I'm just like, I'm your man. He's like, well, yeah, you're going to have to do a bit better than that. Yeah, tell me why. But we got on very well, and we sort of have the same kind of sensibilities, really. And so...
So at that point in the conversation, did you start to discuss the look, the personality of the film, the vision of how you would explain how it would come together with the director? Did that start at that point?
Yeah, it did. I mean, strangely, actually, in terms of references, there were very few external references that we talked about, mainly because everything came off the page, and that was what was so remarkable. It's kind of what I was trying to say about this, is what was quite remarkable about the writing is that it was almost like the images themselves just literally would originate from the page. And I'm used to kind of reading scripts and having discussions with directors, and we draw on other references like other movies or paintings or music or whatever it might be. But in this case, it literally was, there was an image that came to my mind when I first read the script, and it was Ava, the robot, who I didn't know. I had no idea what she looked like at the time. And I'm slightly looking up at her through this sheet of glass, and there's lots of reflections cutting across the glass, and you can just see her eyes cutting through those reflections, and she's having this moment of singularity. And that's the only image I kind of carried with me, and it appears in the film.
So how did you arrive at the look at that point? I mean, it has a very unique look, which we're going to see here in a little bit. How did you get to that? Let's talk about the camera tests first, and then we'll roll into it from there. Talk to me about the camera tests.
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think as everybody does, you test comprehensively, and sometimes you sort of know what the look, you kind of like, you know the ingredients. You're like, okay, I'm going to use this camera, I'm going to use these lenses. That's the look of the movie. And other times, you may be sure, but it's always good to see and envelop all the other options. And sometimes then the movie will just sort of present itself to you, or the look. So you can look through a certain camera and a certain set of lenses and go, this is it, this is the movie. And in this case, we tested 3 cameras, 3 digital cameras, because the question of shooting this on film had kind of gone away very early on in the process, simply because most of the budget, we had set bills. We were shooting in Norway, one of the most expensive countries in the world, and a lot of...
Is it really? To shoot, right?
To shoot,
or even to travel and to get around.
It's like $12 for a beer, man. I mean, come on.
Is it really $12?
Yeah, it's really $12 for a beer. But they're very good. They put their oil money back into the... Anyway, let's not talk about Norway. But it was... It did... So we knew that budgetarily we had to be quite slim with the camera package, and the film thing, because it just wasn't going to happen for economical reasons, wasn't such a big deal for me because this was my first show. This is the first film I shot digitally. Up until that point, I've been lucky enough to shoot just film. So my mindset was very much in that world. So I was looking for a camera and a lens combination that could facilitate very much a sort of film approach, which is just, I think, is a very simple approach. I think it's a very instinctive approach, and you're not tethered to things. You're just simply working with what's in front of you very much. And
so what did you test for? What did you do? I mean, what were you looking for? I mean, you had the look in mind before that with the director, those conversations.
Yeah, I know you keep asking me this, and I'm not answering it. No, I think you're kind of looking for, in this case, a great deal of, in my mind, because it's such a human story, this isn't a VFX movie. I mean, yes, it's a big part of this film, but it's not what this is about. It's a human story, as you'll see. And so it was very important to me, to us as the filmmakers, that we really instill a sense of naturalism to it. And by that, I don't mean a sort of, kitchen, as we would say in the UK, a sort of kitchen sink style naturalism. It's not that. There's a great, it's very stylized, but it needed to have a human element to it. So when you do eventually see Ava for the very first time, yes, you're amazed. You're like, fuck, she's amazing. But at the same time, you very quickly get used to the idea of her being human. That's a very important part of the process. So in choosing the way in which we photograph the film, it had to sort of lend itself very much to a kind of almost very observational style of filmmaking that wasn't intrusive, as the VFX element isn't intrusive. So in choosing cameras and lenses, I didn't want it to be a very self-conscious element in the film. Sure, it's important that the movie looks good, great, but that's just one small part of it.
Right. And the lenses? Talk about the lenses you selected. You actually shot the film anamorphic.
We shot the film anamorphically, and we settled on these old Cooke Crystal Express lenses, which were they're basically like rehoused Cooke Speed Panchro spherical lenses, and they were rehoused in the 80s by a gentleman called Joe Dunton, who built a few sets, and each one is, they're kind of handmade, so they're not sort of, there's, no 50 is the same in all of the different sets. So the reason I picked them is because it became about personality. And it was like, if you choose a 32mm for a certain scene, it's not because you want to go wider, it's because you want the feeling of this 32mm, which is off the scale in terms of its kind of personality, and not for everyone, not for the faint-hearted in some respects. But so the combination of the camera that we chose, the Sony f/65, and these lenses, to me, it was like, this is the movie. This is absolutely the film. It's the palette. It's everything. The way in which, it dealt with what I was seeing with my eye is kind of what I wanted the camera to see. And it wasn't a question of looking through the camera and reinventing it, the look of the movie, by applying a LUT that's sort of irrelevant to what you're seeing. It wasn't that. It was like, we're going to light the set, photograph the set, and present that as that should then carry on through the whole process into editorial and everything, and it should feel
very natural.
Very natural.
Yeah,
in a very unnatural kind of thing, world that's happening.
Right, and talk about the lighting. There's scenes where you had the red, you had a very neutral lighting. Take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, the sets, we shot basically, it's made in 2 locations. A lot of the interiors, the underground element of Nathan's complex is all shot at Pinewood in London on 3 sound stages. And then the exterior elements are in Norway. And so we sort of stitched those 2 things together. Now, we shot all the Pinewood stuff first, and essentially what we always had in our minds was that we want to have enclosed sets. So everything had a ceiling, the doors were sealed, so there was only be one entrance in and out of the set. So when that door was closed, you really felt like you were in this environment. And I'm always a great advocate of like 360-degree shooting to enable the actors to really feel, the space and to be as unintrusive as possible. So that consequently meant that the lighting was then, it became part of the set. It was embedded into the set, which kind of goes along with the character Nathan, who Oscar plays, goes along with his thinking, because he's a slight megalomaniac, and which you'll see, and he. So the sets themselves almost take on his mood. So we reflect his mood in the lighting a lot of the time.
And you use a lot of natural light, like with these scenes here with the daylight coming through. You didn't mess with that at all, right?
I haven't seen this picture before. This is the house.
It's like a behind-the-scenes shot.
Yeah. Yes. So there was a great deal of. So the idea was to kind of, again, even though you've got very contrasting elements, was to make sure that those things really felt quite seamless. And with the natural light, I did combine I sort of augmented it with some, what I use is, I generally use tungsten light exclusively. I don't really use any daylight light, simply because I find it just more malleable, slightly gauzier, and that's a nice picture. And it also goes well with that kind of landscape. I mean, we did light tests for quite some time. We went out there for like a few weeks prior to shooting, and we'd sit up. Alex would get a bottle of whiskey, and we'd just sit up all night, like waiting for the sun to set. It just didn't set. It was like in the middle of the summer in Norway. It was like, when does this fucking sun set? I can't drink any more whiskey, And we'd be photographing constantly, and it's strange how the color of the light changes. Even though your eye sees it as normal daylight, the camera's starting to see it as this really surreal, sort of, crepuscular, blue, purpley thing. And I've no idea why I started talking about that. Why did I start talking about that?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's all good. We're on a roll. Skin tones. Talk about skin tones. That was a big deal for you in this film.
Yes. Well, there is, because again, I suppose you've got 4 very different kinds of skin tones in this movie, and in particular, with Ava, and to a certain degree, Kyoko, there's a sort of slight element of artificiality that you want to be aware of, but you don't want to push it to feel false. There still has to be a human element. So that was always a really important aspect when I was testing, was to look at skin tones and how these cameras reacted and lens combinations reacted to these skin tones, because you don't ever want to lose that human element. And it's something that I always think with film is just, it turns the faces into landscapes. You really do. I know it's slightly pretentious to say, but you can really see somebody's soul when you using film. So I was looking for that basically, and when we tested, like I say, when we tested these 3 different cameras, it was this f/65 strangely that resolved the way my eye saw those skin tones
Most naturally.
Most naturally.
And with the LUTs, the LUTs that you had created, it was very mild, right? I mean, you didn't really do much with.
Exactly. No. Like I said, all we were trying to do was just reflect what we were seeing on set in the camera. That was as simple as that. As if you were looking, as if there were, you're not looking through an electronic eyepiece. You're actually looking through the lens. That's all it was. And so, I use a lot of soft light in this movie. And it has that wraparound effect, and you want to feel it.
So what about resolution? I mean, the camera has a massive amount of resolution. You're recording 16-bit RAW. You've got a huge color palette. Talk to me about resolution and its importance to you in this project.
Well, I mean, we shot 4K, except all the VFX are done in 2K, which actually I think is a slight advantage to the VFX, because it makes them feel, it sort of tempers it a little.
Less aggressive,
less aggressive, yeah. And I think that, in a sense, when you look for a degree of naturalism, what you're also looking for in post-production terms is the ability to make fine changes. And those changes, you're always looking for. It's like in the DI, we'd just be like, just tweak this or tweak that, but not in a reinventing sort of way. And I think that's a really key thing when it comes, for me, when it comes to resolution, because if you can make those tiny changes and you feel it instinctively, it kind of makes sense to me. Rather than, I guess there's a great deal of subtlety. There's a very subtle element that you can do with if you've got the ability to do it, and these cameras have that.
So the scene...
I wasn't paid to say that, by the way.
No, I guarantee you he wasn't. So the scene with the waterfall, where you had to hike, tell us that story. That's really cool. You had to hike like a huge distance. The crew had to be really small.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, there's, when we got to Norway, there were certain locations that we would, on our days off, in prep, Alex was just like bombing up a mountain somewhere, and we'd all follow, and we'd find these quite remote locations. And there was one particular location, which you'll see is a waterfall. It's a completely stunning location, but it took us an hour and a half to get to, walking. So we literally, it was lenses in backpacks, cameras on shoulders. We actually employed, I think there were some Swedish mountain climbers. It was bizarre that they weren't Norwegian now that I think about it in retrospect, but they were Swedish. And they helped us up the mountains with the gear, but we were very stripped back, and it's worth it when you get there. And with this waterfall scene, actually, somebody has since said to me, that was amazing. The VFX on that waterfall was amazing. The way they put that water in, it looks real. And I'm like, it's because it was real. So yeah, so there was that, and then there's a scene where they go to a glacier, and that was the last day of the shoot, and that was, for me, actually, it was the hardest day of the shoot, partly because we were quite exhausted at that point, but we'd finished shooting. We then drove 2 days to get to this glacier. Then we took a boat for 2.5 hours. Then we hiked for another hour and a half, and finally we got to the place that we wanted to shoot. We only had 3 hours to shoot because it took so long to get back, and it was the top of the day. And to me, it became, it was like, oh my God, there's such beauty in this ice, these colors, the way in which the blue comes through, everything, the expanse of this location. When you stand there, you can feel, your field of vision is 180 degrees, but how do you put a frame around that? And I did get, at the end of it, I was getting quite frustrated because I just felt like we come all this way and I was failing. But actually, in the end, it turned out all right, even in that light. But it just goes to show that we were kind of like a little bit committed to this.
So the camera's got built-in NDs, plus on top of that you used filters as well?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so actually in that case, with the glacier, with the internal NDs, and then I'd filter so I'd be like 9 or 10 stops in front of the camera, and I'd look through the camera, I wouldn't be able to see a damn thing, it'd just be like a shape. But it was right, it just resolved beautifully. So there was a lot of that going on. I think we also wanted to give, the idea really was to give the landscape a sense of unease about the way in which you view it. And I think that's always a really interesting thing to me in this, particularly in this context. The brief was really, our own brief to ourselves was really like, we want the landscape, whenever we see exterior moments, we want it to feel subconsciously like we're seeing it from Ava's perspective. And I think it's got that.
So getting back to the lenses real quick. They were glassed in the 80s,
yeah,
right? And you were saying earlier that each lens is distinctly different from the other one. You would get a completely different result just simply changing the lenses. Talk a little bit about that. Each one had a very distinct personality. I mean, really distinct, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, like I say, it wouldn't be if you choose to, and that's kind of the reason why I like these lenses, because they do. The 40mm isn't just a 40mm. It's sort of like it has a way of doing. I don't know. I won't talk too much about it because I want you to see this. Yeah, but I mean, essentially, so even if you have two sets of these lenses, the 40 is not the same as the other 40 in the other in the other set, and it's the kind of risk you sort of take. So then you have to kind of, when you're thinking about, you know, lens widths, you're also thinking about what that means in terms of its personality, how that's going to affect the scene, and it literally is that. I mean, you know, particularly when in combination with this Sony camera, because the camera resolves so sharply, it's picking up everything that the lens sees. And you know, when I used to shoot 16mm, I'd always shoot with very sharp lenses, like master primes, things like that, simply because it could cut through the beautiful grain and everything that 16mm has, but it sort of makes it, you know, three-dimensional, I guess. And this was the opposite of that.
All right, last question, then we'll open it up to the audience real quick. Post-production, you graded the film, then you had a screening session with the director and some others.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, actually initially we had about 10 days to grade the film, and we got to the end of it, and we'd worked really hard. Actually, we got to that point where we were just fine-tuning and everything. We invited the execs and everyone in to see it, a lot of other people who hadn't seen the film, and we screened it in a screening room similar to this. Actually, the grading suit's this kind of size screen, so it's pretty good to see every detail. And we put it up and we looked at it, and I was sat at the back with Alex and Asa Shul, who's a great artist. He's the color timer on the movie, and he's a brilliant man. And we screened it, and everyone was like, oh, afterwards, like, that was great, it's great. So you're done, right? This is it, we're done, we're finished. And Alex and I were just like, actually, we looked at each other and we got to start again. This is the biggest piece of shit. We spent all this time working on it. This is terrible. And it was weird because I don't know why we felt that,
right.
but it was just one of those things where you just like, this isn't the movie. And then we spent a week making changes, and actually the changes aren't. This is what I'm talking about in terms of those kind of minor things. Right. But it's funny actually because that process, and what I really enjoyed about that process is that Alex is very good at pushing. He always wants to go one step further to see if we've made it, you know. Whereas I can get to a certain point sometimes and I'm like, I think we found it. I think we found it. This is great. Whereas he'll go, yeah, we found it, but let's go further and fuck it up and then come back. And, you know, there's a lot of that going on.
All right, very cool. All right, a couple of questions from the audience, if you have any. We'll start right here in the front. We have a microphone coming to you, I think. Give us 1 second so everybody can hear your question. Matt is making his way to the front right here. Yep, this gentleman right here in the front.
Hi. This is my second time seeing the movie. I love it. I think it's great. I have a question about the scenes where you were really reaching into the darkness. What kind of things you had to do? Whether you mentioned you shot with anamorphic lenses, whether you shot all the way open, whether you had to use any gain, whether you messed with ISO. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually an interesting question about camera sensitivity, and I think you know a lot of effort is being put into these days to making cameras that much more sensitive, and which I think is a good thing. But sometimes, actually, you want things to drop into darkness the way in which they should do naturally, and that's all we did with this. We simply would light it in a way that it looks like it's dropping off into darkness, and there would be no effort to push into that darkness. So, in other words, it is what it is. And I know that sounds like a really simplistic thing to say, but it's not. It wasn't much more than that, you know. For me, it comes from the light. If you want something to be on the edge, you make it on the edge, you know. But if you push things too far, and things start to sort of fall apart, I think then you start to notice the artifice of filmmaking. So in this case, yeah, I mean, it would always have to be a combination of making sure the light's right, making sure the balance of the light is right. Then any camera we put on this is gonna you know, deal with it in the right way. But does that answer your question?
Yeah.
What stop were you shooting at?
I shot the entire movie at 2.8, consistently the whole way through, except for 2 shots, one of which was at 5.6 and the other was at 11. Which were exterior shots that we did where I just wanted things to feel slightly stranger than everything else. But apart from that, it was consistently 2.8, so always using NDs and same ISO, yeah, yeah.
Okay, another question? Anybody? Yeah.
Was it an easy process as far as like conversation with the director to figure out, sort of uncover what this movie was going to look like? Did you guys just know right off the bat, or was it like a long period of discovery?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of was like, I sort of want to say, I really want to say like, you know, it was torturous and we took us so long to get to this, but it was actually, it was kind of an easy process. And I think that, again, was due to the fact that it was a real family vibe on this film, you know, a real sort of, like, everybody was so in love with the script, so in love with this idea, that it felt, there was not, you know, nobody, it almost like dispelled any kind of sense of ego from any department, in a way. So it didn't, you know, generally struggles, I have to say, come from those things sometimes, not all the time. Obviously, there are other practical implications of that. But there was a real sense that, you know, we were just like really all working towards one common goal. And that just makes life a lot more interesting in a way, because actually, I think creatively things really start to expand in that way. So yeah, I mean, off the bat, there was very much, like I said, because the script itself really gives you, it just gives you so much. There are so many, even when we were shooting, you know, in some of these scenes, like constantly being presented with new things. Whilst the camera's moving, things are happening in front of you. And even though you've planned everything, new things are continually presenting. And I think that's a sign of, that's just a great sign of a really good, healthy, creative process. And so I'd like to say that, yeah, it was a struggle, man. You know, it was just, but it wasn't. It was actually a dream. And I think actually there's all credit to Alex for creating that sort of family vibe, because he's what you would call a sort of socialist filmmaker. He doesn't really believe in, he actually, you ask him a question about the whole director, what does he call it? The something like the, it's not the auteur theory, but a similar sort of description of the way in which directors, what he believes, you know, directors should and shouldn't be, and is very, you need to ask him about that. But he doesn't go for that whole sort of culture of director, as, you know, he understands that filmmaking is a collaborative process, and which obviously is, but in this instance, it literally was, there was such equality in this process that it did feel the energy was good as a result of it.
Great. One more question, then we'll roll the film. Yep.
Speaking of the collaborative relationship between you and the director, how was your relationship working with the production designer with regard to the lighting of the set in Norway and at Pinewood? I imagine that there was a lot of pre-production issues. Could you briefly talk about your working relationship with the designer?
I fucking hated them. No. The process was, again, you know, when I came onto it, as is often the case with these things, I mean, they'd been on this for a lot longer than I had when I first started. So the sets had started to be designed. One thing, actually, that was very, very different to what I'd seen on the page is that in the Ava observation room, as scripted, there's a wall of glass, and there's one side is Caleb, the other side is Ava. Whereas and I think it was a genius idea, they basically decided to make a glass box within a room, which Caleb sits in, so that actually the effect is then that Ava can observe him observing her, and you get these constant shifts of who's watching who, and that was a direct result of design, you know. And I think we always knew that very early on obviously we were going to embed lights and everything into the set, and I'd have to start creating my own styles of reflections with other lights that I had, upright lights that I had built, to create these much more graphic compositions as the camera moved through them. And that was kind of the only floor lighting we had. But when we talked about putting lights into the set, I think originally they wanted to use, or they were originally thinking like, you know, it's going to be fluorescent because science fiction equals fluorescent light or LED. And I was like, actually, you know, I don't know. I just love tungsten light. I love the ability to control it. And if you can control it in a certain way, you can shape spaces with it. And again, that gauziness that I was talking about, and basically to make it, to kind of dirty it up a bit, you know. And so they had, they hadn't prepared for that. And it was a bit hot. It was a very hot summer when we shot. And when you put 7,000 tungsten bulbs in an enclosed set, there aren't very many happy people, especially Alicia, poor Alicia, who's in a grey rubber mesh suit. She fucking hated me after a while. But yeah, it was worth it.
All right.
I think. Anyway, look, I've got to stop talking, man, because you got to see the movie. And
Rob Hardy, BSC, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, mate. Outstanding.